So let's jump right in with the very basics. We're going to look at web applications created with TMS WEB Core and what makes them different from a Windows binary, from an executable, and what the Delphi IDE does for us in the background to run these applications, because that is still something that needs a little bit of explanation. When I join customers for the first time, when they create their first web projects, there is still a little bit of uncertainty here. So we're going to look at this in great detail. What is going on beyond or under the hood? Let's take a deep dive how TMS WEB Core applications look under the hood, what the IDE does for us. And I'm really going to start from scratch, so you don't think I'm going to do anything, prepare anything that's not the same on your system. So I'm just going to create a new web application, file, new, other, go to TMS Web, and then TMS Web Application, the basic template, nothing fancy. And from there, we're going to just save the project, save all here. And the one thing that I'm always going to do is I name this project 1.html, I name that index. The reason for that is, and I'm going ahead a little bit here, is that most web servers will not require you to enter the index.html. So you can leave that out. So for example, if you go to any web page on this planet, you basically go to, let's say you go to here, or let's say you go to nhl.com, you don't have to type index.html, right? You just type nhl.com, enter, but internally, that's what's happening. They open a different page. They open an HTML document of some sort. Same for tmssoftware.com. You can be sure that TMS software has some sort of index in there that shows you this page. So even though you don't specify the file per se, the web server has to serve something, right? And this, in this particular case for TMS WEB Core, the index.html makes it possible for you to not having to bother about it, okay? That's what we're going to do first. So right here, the main form, u form main, enter, and then we have the project one HTML. I'm going to make that index.html, and you see that because we saved the main form already, that also has, in addition to the path and the DFM file, it also gets the HTML file for the HTML that is specific for that form, and then index.html. That's the entry point, so to speak. More on that later. And then this is just our Hello World project. Okay. There we go. So we have Hello World Web with the index.html and the main form. And the main form, we're just going to say name. I'm going to say form main. And as basically as caption, we're going to say Hello World project. And then we're going to drop a label. And that web label, we're going to assign a font. The font is going to be something that it should be available on all different systems. That's very important. If you pick Segway or whatever the pronunciation is, that's a bad choice, because that is only available on Windows systems. So something like Helvetica is a good thing, but Helvetica is Arial on Windows, and it is automatically transferred on other systems. So Arial, and then let's make it 16 big, okay. And leave everything as it is. We're just going to rename it to time, or LBL, or label time, okay? That's it. And if we run this now, what is happening? Okay, so let's look at this in great detail. So if we start this, the compiler compiles our Pascal code into what? Well, it compiles it to JavaScript, right? So what happens is, if we leave the web browser aside for a second, if we go here and right click and say show in Explorer, we get a TMS web directory and a Win32 directory. You can ignore the Win32. We are just interested in the TMS web. And in there we get debug. Why debug? Because we said for the build configuration debug, not release. If we had chosen release, then we would have had a release folder there. So debug, and this is our application with index.html, with the HTML for our main form, and the actual implementation or application, the JavaScript file with our application. That's what's happening. All the stuff that you code is being converted, transpiled, so to speak, into a JavaScript file. The mapping file is additional debug information that you should never deploy on a production server. If you are still in development, you can deploy this file because it gives you additional information when you use your application. However, you should only deploy the JS, the HTML files. But of course, if you deploy, you're going to flip to release, and then you're going to do a separate compile with the release version. What's happening then, as I already alluded to, we no longer only have the debug, we also get a release folder, and in this release folder we then have the JavaScript file and 2 HTML files, and the map file is gone, so you can't basically deploy something that is too detailed or contains debug information and all that sort of stuff. You might have noticed that it says obfuscate, and the obfuscation is something really specific. You can also do it and enable it in the debug configuration if you would like to. What happens is, if you look at the file size 322, and here we have 2 megabytes. It literally removes everything that is not needed from the JavaScript, because JavaScript is a text file, right? So if we go in here and look at it in an editor, this is what it looks like if it's obfuscated. And if we go back and look at the debug file here, and then look at it, see, you can read it. That's obfuscation. It takes out all the unnecessary line feed. It also sometimes replaces variables so that it makes your code less readable, because this source code is being transferred to the browser. So this makes a huge difference when your application gets called, if you have to transfer 2 megabytes or just 300 kilobytes. Okay, so whenever you deploy to production, always use the release build. That's rule number 1, so to speak. We're just going to look at the debug build though, because it's faster, because we save the obfuscation time, obviously. And the thing is, TMS WEB Core is able to show us our application inside of the browser. And it opens up something, localhost 8000 hello world index.html. Where does this come from? Well, first of all, we have in the tray icon bar here, we have this thing. And this is the TMS web server. So whenever I get a question like, we don't have a web server, but we can still run TMS WEB Core applications, Delphi developers are surprised there is a web server all the time. TMS is just starting it for us aside of the IDE, and it's hiding it a little bit from us, you know? So the web server is here. It's right here, this thing here. And the icon is the Sparkle icon. So TMS internally uses a Sparkle web server to host your TMS WEB Core application when you use the Start button inside of the IDE. So we go here, and we see the TMS web server, and here is the base URL, and this is the root directory of the application. So this should ring a bell now, because if we look and right-click here and say, go open output path in Explorer right here, this thing, video TMS WEB Core debug, is what is being referenced here as the directory. So what happens is that a web server is started for this particular directory with this URL. And you notice there is no -index.html because that's implicit, right? So go in here, this is the file, and I think the TMS web server does not support the index automatically. You see, you're not getting any file. You need to attach the HTML here in this case. And what does localhost 8000 mean? 8000 is the port that this is hosted on. So localhost is your computer, your local machine, and the port is 8000 and not 80, not 443. Those are ports that might sound rather common to you. The 8000 is a good port because it won't interfere with 80 and 443. It is something that is suitable for development. And TMS WEB Core, when it's installed on your system, reserves this port. This is not something that is possible without an installer or a setup. Windows wouldn't allow you to run a server on port 8000 without you configuring it. And this configuration is done using a utility all behind the back. You don't notice any of this. So if you start this utility, you can go to, you type TMS HTTP config right here. And this is the utility that shows you all the different ports that are reserved on your machine. And if you go down here, you see that 8000 is reserved. That TMS Sparkle registers this in your Windows system, and Windows uses the so-called http.sys network stack, or whatever you want to call it. And there you register and say, hey, I want to run on port 8000. I want to be able to run my servers or web application or whatever. So here you see HTTP plus is a wildcard for localhost 8000 dash. That also implies, because you see here that it's hello world, that because you reserve the top path, that all paths that are under this are available as well. If you had written here HTTP --plus colon 8000 / hello world, if you had create a second TMS WEB Core application, you won't be able to use port 8000 without specifying another reservation here. This 8000 means it's reserved for all the paths that you might create. So 8000 is literally a general specifier for all your web applications that you might create with TMS WEB Core. And the 8000, that is something that TMS WEB Core configures by default. If you go to your Tools options, and then you go to TMS Web options, and here, there you see it, URL HTTP localhost 8000 / project name. Okay, that's where this comes from. And every project you create will then get this default URL. And then your project, if you go to the options there, these are the project specific options. You go to compile. Also note that these can be specified both for debug and release. It's always something where bugs happen. You know, I changed it. Well, you changed it in the wrong configuration. So debug configuration, and you notice that there is no specification whatsoever. The HTML file here, the index.html is specified, but there is nothing with regards to the web server or the web server parameters. Nothing has been specified. And that's intentional. That means that the global defaults from Delphi are being used. If you wanted to run your application on a different port, you would make these changes here. However, you would also have to make the reservation in the TMS HTTP tool to reserve that port for you. Okay? Very important. So what we've learned so far is that TMS WEB Core starts a web server for us, and it automatically adds the output path of our application to the server so that we can go to a browser and then launch the application in that web server. Okay, you can also, if you want to break it, so to speak, you can click here on stop. So now this web server is stopped, and if I enter this now, it won't connect anymore. See? And now this site can't be reached. If I start it again, it immediately appears again. And all this is done by the IDE integration from TMS WEB Core that comes with the product. This is something that TMS does for you. Let me just preface this, that I've seen it many, many times that Delphi developers now start to say, okay, I have a web server running on port 8000 with my application. Let's configure my router at home and forward it to this address here. And that's how TMS WEB Core applications can be hosted, literally. You know, if you have a reverse proxy or something, you can even add SSL that way. You host your application. The downside is, if you open a different application with TMS WEB Core and run it, this server might not be running anymore, because this is just designed to provide a server for the application that you're editing in the IDE right now. So if you open another project that other project obviously might go away. That is not the concern of TMS, that you host multiple applications with this. So be very, very careful if you make use of this. I always say you need a dedicated web server, not the one that is provided here, because this also hasn't got any functionality for load balancing, for certificates. Nothing is included in this. This is literally a helper so that you can run and test your applications during development. This is not designed to be published to the outside world and then get used this way, because honestly, you don't have much control when these services or when these servers get started and stopped, because the IDE most of the time has to be running in order for it to work. So I wouldn't rely on this. This is just how it works under the hood if you make changes to your application. And let's actually spend a little bit more time with this application. I want to add a timer component. Name it timer, and let's keep it at 1 second. And let's define the event on timer. We say label time dot caption. Then we just say date time to string now. So the current time on the system, we save this, gets shown. So we just recompile. And now what happens is the IDE copies the new files into the directory, and then we open up the URL again in the browser, and the web server reads the files again, and that's it. What happens? And now we have the application running with time automatically being updated with the label. A very, very simple web application, of course, but so far we've shown how it works under the hood. Also, what is happening if you run your application? Because that is also something that has to be explained in detail. If we press F12 in order to open the developer console, I think you can also right-click here, or for example, right-click here and then go to Inspect Element, and this opens also this. But we go to the Network tab, and then we go back. This should be empty. We go back to the address bar of the browser and we press Enter. And then we see all the different requests that go on between your local machine and the web server. Don't be confused that the web server, of course, is also on your machine. That doesn't add anything, or that doesn't take away anything from the process. So here you see first, we access index.html. This is the URL that we're trying to access. And the browser does a GET request to this URL. And then the web server answers and sends us hello-world.js, the JavaScript application that is our TMS WEB Core application. That's it. And then the u4 main.html gets loaded with other JavaScript files. But the important thing is the index.html file is the first one, and that triggers the hello world.js file. So if we go into the index.html file, look at the response, we see the source code of the index.html file that is requested from the web server. And in there we see the reference to the hello world.js. And that means that the web server knows if I return this index.html, I also need to return the hello world.js to the client. And here is our TMS WEB Core application, which is then run inside of the browser. And that is the most important thing you have to understand when working with TMS WEB Core. At this point, the application runs inside of the browser, customer side, client side, no longer on your web server. So all the resources that you need have to be requested from some server on the internet, because the application runs locally on the system of the person that accessed the web application. And even looking at this here, that is the case, because your computer accesses the resources from a web server that runs on localhost, admittedly, but still, you don't have access to your local file system. You can't access any of the resources of your computer. You can only access what the web browser provides to you. And that is very, very important to understand. Let me add to this. If you add, for example, here a file to your project, for example, a JSON file, or you think you can add a configuration file, an INI file, that file will reside in this directory, which is your deployment directory, which is the web server directory. If your application runs inside of the web browser here, it doesn't know that there is a file on your web server. So the only thing you can do in order to get this file, you have to literally download it. You have to request it from the web server. And that is a very different concept from building VCL applications or FireMonkey applications, because your application runs in the browser of the customer. And let's say that's I would say the number one question: why can't I, if I have this form, take a FireDAC or a MySQL or whatever, why can't I drop these components on this form and then connect to my database server? Because that would mean that your customer from their computer connects directly to your database. And that is most likely impossible. And that's why you need a backend which responds with HTTP requests that you can basically implement things like here. If you type in HTTP, the web HTTP request, and then you can define a URL and request resources from the internet. And these resources are provided by web services or by special database-specific web services like StellarDS, where StellarDS has an HTTP interface if you don't want to use any components. However, TMS makes it very easy for you because they provide the Stellar Dataset client dataset, which is similar to the T dataset from the VCL, that you can access your databases as if you were writing a VCL application. TMS abstracts everything. It tosses everything away so that you don't have to learn all the stuff under the hood. You can just concentrate on your tables, on your queries, and then on the data. You don't have to deal with the web requests that go on under the hood. That's the magic of StellarDS in this case. Let me close this example right here. We come back to this example because this will be the example that we will deploy to different servers first, because I wanted to keep it very, very simple. I want to show you one more complex example though. This is an example I showed in a previous How It Works with Holger episode. It extracts standings information from a StellarDS database right here. And let's look at what's happened. So if we go to the web server again, we see that we now have two applications hosted in our TMS web server. So believe it or not, you can go back to this, and this application is still available because it's still running in the web server. And this is why a lot of people think if they develop with TMS WEB Core, oh, I can use this to host my applications externally. It might work for a while, but at some point, TMS WEB Core might clean this up. Okay, there's no guarantee that these stay in here. So in addition to the Hello World, we now have this other project here. Again, port 8000, because that's what I defined as a default, with the name of the project, Nginx. And of course, I use my index HTML again. The interesting part is if I press F12 here and go back to the network tab and press enter again, we find out something very, very different. As you can see, there is way more things going on. So first of all, same thing. We request the index application from the web server, and that does not, and this is the first difference, it does not return the JavaScript first, no, because if we look at the response, before we get to the JavaScript, we also reference a style sheet, and this is exactly what I said before. Here, this style sheet is right here in my project, and it's also in the folder of the web server. So if I go to Show in Explorer, TMS Web, Debug, and there is my style.css. So it's hosted by the web server as well, and it can be requested using the URL. So either like from the web browser here, linked with the style CSS. You can also do this, copy, go to the web browser here, and you should be able to say style.css. And there you go. So this is no different from having basically some files uploaded in a directory that is accessible through a certain directory. Just directories are kind of addressed differently on the internet using this HTTP syntax, right? And the key thing to remember here is that now the web browser does all these downloads for you because you reference these inside of your HTML. The HTML literally says, link this style CSS file because you need it in order to present the content of this HTML file, okay? And then the second one is the JavaScript file again. And this, of course, is once again a reference to your actual application that is running. And what happens is, there it goes. There is your Nginx.js, and it's being executed. And as soon as that is being executed, what is happening is it is showing the first form. And again, the first form is this right here. But in there, I have specific HTML, which references CSS, which is defined in the style CSS. And also in my CSS, I have the definition, if you look here, that I want to import this file. So guess what? This downloads the information from Google. And this is what a lot of companies in Europe have to deal with right now, because this is an external call to Google. And if you need to write some sort of data privacy notice or data privacy document, this would mean that you would have to include Google in this, right? Because I'm not hosting this myself. I'm including a font, as you can see from fonts.googleapis.com, from Google. That means that the font is downloaded from a server that I don't control, so I have to include that in my data privacy document as well. And the download, once again, is automatic because it is part of the style CSS. So when the form is getting shown, it executes my JavaScript, and that's it. And during the execution, you see these things here. What is this? Well, this is the first contact from StyleRDS, because in our project, we use, even though if you have looked at the video, we use this data store client dataset. And I said TMS does a lot of stuff under the hood that you don't have to create these HTTP requests manually. You just specify, I want this table, and this is the word query I want to use, okay? And with that being said, what happens internally is, first of all, the component is going to look, okay, do we have the project? What are the projects? And then it's going to say, give me the table. Here's the table. So you get all this is the HTTP API from StyleRDS. And then, once again, it gets the data for the table. After getting, does the table exist? Give me the table. And there you go. This is the table data in JSON format. And then the component that we dropped on the form is going to transfer that all so you can digest it using the T data set. What do we have here? These are just like functions that are being loaded internally. This must be a plugin I use in my browser. It has nothing to do with TMS WEB Core. So this is what is going on under the hood. And you can concentrate on using the data and doing all that kind of stuff. You don't need to implement any of these requests by yourself. Again, this is what you formally call a backend, because the backend delivers the data for this table. But the front end, your TMS WEB Core application, is issuing requests to the backend. And it's not like something that you have on the same computer that you have your web server on. That is the key fact here, because your TMS WEB Core application is executed client-side on the customer's machine. So if you were to connect to localhost where also the database server was running, like in the old days when you had a VCL application, you had your VCL application, and on the same machine you had the database server, or in the same network you had the database server running, you can't connect that way. Instead, the front end, which is running on the customer machine, is executing requests to StellarDS. And if you look at the header here, this is where it's going to. It's going to API StellarDS IO to an API, but you don't have to do any of that yourself because you can concentrate on using TMS controls. This component does that all for you. And that's the great advantage of using TMS WEB Core with StellarDS in the beginning, because you don't have to deal with any of the nitty-gritty stuff. You can focus on the important stuff, presenting your data and getting to know front-end development on the web with TMS WEB Core. Okay, this concludes the first episode with the details what is going on under the hood. If you create a TMS WEB Core application, that the IDE creates a web server for you. And in the next part, we are going to look at how we take the files from an application and use another web server to host our application in that web server. We're going to look at a Windows solution with IIS, and we're going to look at a Linux solution with Nginx. And of course, we can also use a Docker container. That is something I put into the mix as well. If you want this written up all in a very, very concise way, please have a look at my web application development with Delphi book. It has a giant chapter including Docker deployment for TMS WEB Core applications. This video series definitely is helpful, but the book will provide a written up summary of all the essential key facts that you can always refer to. And as said, you go to holgerscode.com and then you click on books, web application development with Delphi, and you get all the different links for all the different order sites here. Just make sure you order the second edition, because the German first edition does not contain the chapter on deployment. Only the English second edition contains the deployment chapter. I just want to be very precise on that only the second edition contains the deployment. Thanks so much for your interest. Give us a thumbs up if you like this content. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the second episode. Stay safe. Bye-bye.